Come all ye young fellows that follow the sea, tip me way, hey, below the man down. Now pray pay attention and listen to me. Give me some time to blow the man down. I'm a deep water sailor, just come from Hong Kong. Tip me way, hey, below the man down. If you'll give me some whiskey, I'll sing you a song. Give me some time to blow the man down. On a trim black ball liner, I first served my time. Tip me way, hey, below the man.
What is it that sailing across oceans has to teach us about fear, loneliness, and despair? Being alone on a small boat for weeks at a time in a vast ocean, far from shore, far from loved ones, far from every visible reminder of your own past, is a transformative experience. It changes you. It has changed me. I'm convinced it rewires your brain. It forces you to do things that most of us rarely do anymore in our busy lives. It means being still and quiet for hours and days and weeks at a time. It means conforming the rhythm of your life to nature in a way that we have forgotten how to do in our world of electric lights and television and the internet. It means getting wet when it rains, getting tanned when the sun shines, making headway when the wind blows, and sitting perfectly still when the wind stops. It means sleeping when the sun goes down and rising when the sun comes up, all the while surrounded by something so beautiful and vast that, like outer space, although you are right in the middle of it, it is beyond your ability to comprehend fully. And also like outer space, the sea is an environment so inhospitable to human life that to fall into it accidentally far from shore with no one to pull you to safety and nothing to buoy you up would mean a slow wait for certain death. For that reason, on my boat there is an emergency life raft. It sits on deck, strapped down and tied to the strongest and most central thing on the boat, which is the mast. An emergency life raft is a marvel of engineering. Inside this case, which weighs about 6 stone or 80 pounds, is an automatically inflatable platform fully enclosed by an inflatable dome. There is a long nylon strap attached to the pin on a CO2 cartridge inside the life raft, and the theory goes that when I pull that strap in my moment of greatest need, the life raft will automatically blow itself up into something resembling a small bouncy castle. While this raft floats and rolls with the roughest of seas, the theory is that anyone inside will roll and bob safely with it until help arrives. But the truth is, I have never tested this theory, and I don't really think about my emergency life raft and never really have. And most sailors are the same. I know it's there in case I need it, and if and when I should ever need it, I know I'm really, really, really going to need it. But most of the time, I don't think about it. Most of the time, I'm busy with the things that have nothing to do with saving my life in an emergency, like making sure I am getting where I want to go, and feeding myself, entertaining myself, and enjoying myself as much as I can along the way. The life raft is the most important piece of equipment on the boat, but I really never think about it as being essential to my day-to-day life. It's there for emergencies only, not to help me sail. That's a pretty good metaphor for how I have regarded my relationship with God for most of my life. He is the most important thing in all of our lives, but we tend to keep him stowed away for emergencies. Today, however, I'm going to pull the pin on the emergency life raft to explain to you how, exactly, you can best deal with fear and loneliness and despair, because as it turns out, God is the answer to that question. Not just some last resort that you go to when all else fails. He is literally the answer. Now, for those of you who tuned in thinking that you were going to hear some hidden secret of sports training philosophy, some strategy that sailors use to cope with fear and loneliness along the lines of how runners cope with shin splints, or how Andy Murray stays focused on his backhand, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. The secret I have to share with you is no secret at all, nor is it unique to sailors. It is in fact the same gospel that is preached in St. Luke's Church every Sunday. In thinking about a topic for my talk, I chose fear and loneliness because these are the two subjects that most often come up when I tell people about my plans. Aren't you afraid? People will ask. Or, won't you get lonely? They are usually surprised to learn that the answer to both questions is yes, and they seem puzzled that I still do it. To explain why, I'd like to begin by reading to you two favorite passages of mine from the New Testament. The first is in the book of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And the person the gospel writer is referring to here is Jesus. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with awe, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him?" The second reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. Then he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, have no fear." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The writer of the Gospel of Mark in the first reading tells us that the disciples were afraid. Not just afraid, but afraid they were going to die. And in the irrational anger that often comes with great fear, you can sense they were deeply angry at Jesus, that he was presuming to sleep when they were so terrified and in such great danger. So, what does Jesus say to them? He doesn't ask them, "Where is your life raft?" or "Where is your radio?" or "Where is your storm jib?" or "Where is your sextant?" He doesn't ask them, "Where is your personal flotation device?" or "Where is the anchor?" or "Where is your yoga mat?" or "Where is your organic basil and soy protein smoothie?" He asks them, "Where is your faith?" Why? Because faith is the solution to fear. Jesus' answer is no different than what we might say to someone who is suffering needlessly with a headache. Have you no paracetamol? Or for you Americans, have you no Tylenol? Faith is the never-fail antidote to fear. Now, as you may know, this event was advertised widely in hopes that we would draw a large crowd to raise a lot of money and awareness for our cause. For that reason, it occurred to me that there might be a few people in the audience who not only don't go to this church, but don't go to any church, and in fact, don't accept what I'm saying about faith because they don't believe at all. And I wondered if my remarks about Jesus would sound a little presumptuous to some of you, if not a little arrogant, as if I simply assumed that everyone follows Jesus as a guide for life. I don't assume that for a minute. In fact, one of the most remarkable things I learned about the British after I came here 5 years ago is how many of you are proudly and militantly atheist. In America, the number of people who define themselves as Christian has declined rapidly with this latest generation, but it's still about 65% of the population, and about 40% of the people in the United States still show up to church every week. The number of people in America who describe themselves as atheists is only about 5% of the country. They are mostly young, and those who are not young are overwhelmingly white, urban, politically liberal, and well-educated. In America, atheists are still regarded as a small and rather weird little group, so much so that many atheists are a bit sheepish to admit they are atheists in social settings. In Britain, on the other hand, the population that regularly goes to a church has been decimated in the last 75 years. In my short time here, I have been astonished at how many people I have met who have rather confidently and matter-of-factly said to me, "Oh, we don't believe." In America, hearing someone say that out loud still takes people's breath away. In Britain, not so much. And so I decided that before I explain to a British audience why God and faith are the answer to fear and loneliness, I need to say a few words about atheism and respond to the atheist view that God and faith are simply an illusion of the simple-minded, or, as Karl Marx said, the opiate of the masses. I'm going to spend a good deal more time talking about atheism in this presentation on fear and loneliness than perhaps you would have expected, but it occurred to me that there will be no point in talking about faith to a people who have no faith. So I ask for your patience, but more importantly, your attention to what I am about to tell you. As I understand him, the typical atheist believes that the world we see around us exploded randomly into existence from a chaos of gas many billions of years ago, and that we are living today in the extraordinarily unlikely aftermath of this tremendous explosion. How unlikely? Well, mathematicians and physicists who are much cleverer than I have calculated the odds of producing the world we know by explosion, and as it turns out, you would be more likely to flip a coin and have it come up heads 30 trillion times in a row than to explode planet Earth and our solar system randomly into existence. But of course, the problem with atheism and the Big Bang Theory is not just one of odds. There is an existential problem in our inability to say who supplied the fuel for the explosion. In other words, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there such a thing as existence? Why is there such a thing as a thing? There is no field of science and no scientist, no matter how brilliant, who can answer that question. Because science, by definition, begins where the natural world begins, which is why the atheist requires that he be supplied with a chemistry set to use in explaining how the world got started. But again, that leaves unanswered the question of who supplied the chemistry set, and why we find that many celebrity atheists get extremely irritated if you take their chemistry set away. But the fact is, if you're going to imagine that there has always been something called existence, and that this existence came pre-stocked with the materials needed to create our world by means of a huge explosion, you might as well skip the Big Bang altogether and just say instead that whoever was smart enough to create the materials also used them to put the world together for us. In other words, if you're going to buy a desk from IKEA, you might as well let them put it together for you, because it's not going to put itself together. It's going to take you all afternoon to do it on your own. Your wife will be interfering the whole time, and you'll probably get it wrong in the end anyway. Even if one supposes that the universe began as a giant vacuum or void of some kind, and through some miracle of particle physics, where once there were no particles, suddenly particles appeared, an existential problem remains. The very idea of a vacuum or a void has no meaning except in opposition to the existence of something, in opposition to the idea of time, space, and matter. Darkness has no meaning except in relation to light. Emptiness has no meaning except in relation to fullness. The very idea of existence itself cannot be assumed, because on what basis and by what logic would we insist that anything must exist? But Britain's secular faith doesn't stop there. Atheists believe that the Big Bang did two things. One is to create something from nothing, and the other is to create life from non-life. Now, the first hypothesis can never be tested because there is no laboratory called nothing. We cannot conduct an experiment that begins in nothingness because we, the experimenters, exist and work in a material world. You can super collide all the atoms you like, as fast as you like, but if you're starting with atoms or gases in time and space, you are starting with a world that already exists, and you have not answered the question of where you got time, matter, and space to begin with. Scientists have been knocking themselves out and awarding each other Nobel Prizes for smashing atoms together and mixing chemicals together to create all sorts of odd reactions. But the one thing that no scientist on Earth has ever been able to do is to create life from non-life. No scientist has ever created so much as a single living cell, much less something so phenomenally complex as a common housefly. But if you are an atheist, the good news is that you should be fearless. Why? Because you believe that after you die, you become a non-entity. You won't be lying in your grave thinking, what a shame I had that heart attack. If only I had been a vegetarian. Why? Because sooner or later the vegetarian atheist will be lying in the grave next to you, and because, per your belief, he will have no conscious existence after this life, he won't be thinking, thank goodness I didn't eat cheeseburgers like the poor sap lying in the grave next to me, because I got to live 10 years longer. He won't be savoring the memory of those extra 10 years, or remembering how great it was to be thin rather than fat, or what a wonderful time he had trekking through the Himalayas while the other fellow was already dead. He won't remember anything because there will no longer be a he or a him to do the remembering. In other words, for the atheist, there is no meaning to our existence that transcends our immediate physical reality. Life is just one long trip through an amusement park of different sensations, and when you get off the last ride, you cease to exist. You, along with your memory of what you did or didn't do on earth, your fears and regrets, your hopes and your dreams, your proudest achievements and your darkest crimes, all disappear into the ether of non-existence. So the point of life for some atheists quite naturally becomes to have as much fun as they can whilst they are wandering through the amusement park of life. Make the most money, eat the best food, take the best vacations, have the most sex, drive the nicest cars, wear the nicest clothes, have the biggest house, acquire the most toys, and so on. This, to Christians, is a lie as old as time. But as a society, we've been selling this lie to the public very aggressively in the last 50 years, and the campaign has had great success. We are now standing on the brink of a brave new world, which, for the first time in history, is actually telling itself with a straight face that the universe created itself by accident, and that human beings are part of that accident. This is new. For you see, as any number of well-known Christian scholars and historians have observed, if you had told Pontius Pilate or any Roman or Greek or pagan that there was no God, they all would have looked at you as if you were a madman. True, they had various and conflicting ideas about who God was, and Pontius Pilate was blind to the fact that the man standing before him was God incarnate. But he, along with virtually everyone in the ancient world, firmly believed that God existed. What is new about this generation and our world is that the majority of people we call the elite, the wealthy and highly educated, but also increasingly people in every strata of society, not only doubt the existence of God, but firmly believe that everything we see in the world and the universe is just a huge, meaningless happenstance. So how is this new way of thinking playing out? Well, middle-aged atheists in London and their friends were very likely raised in Christian homes by Christian parents in a Christian society that was so steeped in the mores and customs and manners and tenets of Christian belief as to make those things almost invisible, like sugar dissolved in water. So invisible, in fact, that some atheists have taken the world bequeathed to them by 2,000 years of Christian history and convinced themselves that the central animating feature of Western civilization is not Christ, but rather a Christ-like school of philosophy, as if Christianity were nothing more than a clever seminar program that could be co-opted, decoupled from any moral imperative, and rebranded as something totally new called secular humanism. It all very much reminds me of the little boy who took a rucksack, stuffed it with food and clothing lovingly provided for him by his parents, and ran away from home. With his knapsack on his back, he tells himself that he really doesn't need mom and dad, and that life, as it turns out, is really pretty easy. He wonders what all the fuss was about over having to obey his parents, do his chores, stay in school, and work hard. My goodness, he says, that was all just a lie his parents told him to control him for their own diabolical purposes. He can do just fine on his own without any of that. Just fine, that is, until the supplies he has taken from his parents' home start to run out. In my view, many of the ills we see in society are not chiefly the result of poverty or racism or discrimination or sexism or hunger or illness or inadequate funding of social programs, all of which are enormous problems but were far greater problems for previous generations that coped with them much better than we do today and with much less widespread social pathology in the form of crime, suicide, addiction, mental illness, teenage pregnancy, divorce, domestic violence, and juvenile delinquency. These problems, as it turned out, have much less to do with economics and politics than we were led to believe, which is why they continue to get worse despite the various economic and political schemes we keep throwing at them. Instead, these problems have a great deal to do with the fact that the supplies from the storehouse of our own common Christian faith are starting to run low in the brave new world we have invented for ourselves and our children. What is that world? Well, for starters, we have taught our children that the universe itself and their presence within it are colossal and meaningless accidents, and that for this reason their lives on earth have no eternal significance or meaning. We have told them that because ultimately nothing survives their physical existence, nothing transcends their physical desires. And guess what? It turns out they've been listening. Who are we to tell the child today who looks at all the ways he can entertain himself during this short, meaningless trip through the amusement park and says, "You know what? I don't think I'll take the yoga ride, or the gardening ride, or the baking, or the backpacking, or the bicycling rides like my parents. I'd like to take the rape ride in this amusement park." Or, "I'd like to take the random senseless violence ride." Or, "I'd like to take the gang ride." Or, "I'd like to take the ride where I bring a gun to school and watch my classmates run in terror while I shoot them." When you turn to that child and say, "No, don't do those things because that wouldn't be morally acceptable," he will rightly turn to you and ask, "Whose morals? By what authority do you presume to tell me what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior?" In an accidental world in which human life has no transcendent meaning, who indeed are you to tell that child what is right and what is wrong? In a world in which every person is headed to absolute oblivion, what possible relevance do your opinions about right and wrong have to anyone? The answer is none. It's a worldview called nihilism, and we live in a world increasingly held hostage to it. We have robbed our children of the ability to see meaning and transcendence in the world because we have told them that their lives have no meaning or transcendence. They live instead in the two-dimensional world we have created. The third, unseen dimension that once was God has been taken from them. No wonder it often seems that many of them can't grasp anything deeper than Marvel comic superhero movies and cartoons. It's true, we were never a society in which everyone accepted the gospel as truth, but we were once a society in which most of us did. And as it turns out, the whole culture was buoyed up and kept afloat by that fact. That is no longer true today, and if you have found yourself thinking that the world seems a much coarser place than it used to be, more crass, more superficial, more materialistic, less committed to high ideals, and less willing to sacrifice for those ideals, you're not imagining those things. The world has changed, and not for the better, and it has absolutely nothing to do with our economic philosophy, and absolutely everything to do with our decision to reinvent God in our own image. My point being that we are regressing massively and rapidly as a culture, but still we are quick to say, "Never fear, citizens, we have a political scheme that will fix all that." There is never a shortage of politicians and social scientists who are ready to tell us If we just tweak this policy or fund this program, if we just give everyone more money and better health care and better education and more job training, we will soon create a perfect society. And of course, those are all laudable and worthwhile goals, but we keep mistaking them for solutions. The reason the perfect society never comes, and indeed things seem to be going from bad to worse, is that we are increasingly incapable to hear what Christ was trying to tell us when he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Like Pontius Pilate, when Jesus says, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice," society answers back, "What is truth?" The truth is that you can have a civil government apart from God, and you can have a prosperous and powerful society apart from God. But in the long run, you cannot have a successful society apart from God. And importantly for my talk here today, you cannot conquer your fears apart from God. Christ tells his disciples again and again, "Fear not, and peace be with you." Why? Because fear is a victory for Satan. Fear is a rejection of the hope Christ offers us by his death, and in that way a rejection of the power of the cross. A rejection of the power that reassures us, "Fear not, this body of yours is not all there is. That warm house and warm bed and nice car and good food are not all there is. Your job is not all there is. That mound of dirt under which you will be buried and the flowers and tears that will be planted there are not all there is." Many of you in the audience will listen to my plans and take comfort in knowing you've got the good sense not to be crossing an ocean in a small boat. But I'm here to tell you that comfort is an illusion. We are all on a journey headed out of this world, because this world is not all there is. We are pilgrims to another place, and whether we end our pilgrimage in a storm in the middle of the ocean or in a hospital bed in Lewisham, we cannot help but be afraid and lonely at times, but we should never despair. Fear and loneliness are immutable facts of our human condition, but despair is a choice. It isn't fear that sinks Peter in the waves. Christ knows he is afraid. Who wouldn't be afraid? What sinks Peter is despair. Despair is nothing more than fear without faith. Peter despairs that the grace of God that is calling him out into the water is not bigger than death and will not be sufficient to save him. What is Christ doing by calling him to walk out on the water? He is calling Peter to believe that the raging sea is not all there is, that the howling wind is not all there is, that this earthly life is not all there is, that death is not all there is. A little baby daring to take his first steps without holding on is afraid. Why? Because he's never done it before and doesn't really know if there is such a thing as walking. He might never be able to do it himself were it not for two very important facts. Number one, he's seen his father do it. And number two, his father is right there with him, telling the child that he can do it too, and that everything will be all right. This is literally the story of the gospel of Jesus walking on the water, and it is metaphorically the story of our faith journey. When Jesus called Peter to walk to him on the water, Jesus was standing on the water himself. Jesus had done first what he was asking Peter to do, and Peter had seen Jesus do it. When Jesus asks us to believe that we will rise to life after death, it's because Jesus has risen to new life himself, and not only his followers, but hundreds upon hundreds of people saw him do it. Jesus has already done what he is promising we can do. The Bible tells us that great crowds in Jerusalem came out to see Jesus enter the city and then go to his death on Calvary. He did not die in secret. There was no denying or faking his death. The Jewish leaders handed him over to be crucified. The crowd shouted for him to be crucified. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate ordered him to be crucified. He was crucified, and the soldiers stabbed his side with a spear just to make sure he was dead. Then, on the third day, he didn't walk out of the tomb, call an Uber, go to heaven, and send his disciples a text message that he had arrived. He appeared to them bodily and in person for 40 days. He ate meals with them. He invited Thomas to put his fingers in the nail holes. As I speak, the world is in the throes of a massive panic about the latest coronavirus. You have no doubt heard countless news stories about the existence of the virus, the number of people who have been tested and found to be infected, and the number of people who have died of the virus. I'm sure there's not a doubt in your mind that all of those things are real. But the truth is, you haven't seen the coronavirus, and you probably haven't met anyone who has the coronavirus, nor do you know anyone who has died. Why do you believe the news you're hearing? Because of what life has taught all of us about human nature, which is that if a story this easily disprovable were not real, the story wouldn't spread. People everywhere who are in a position to know that no such thing had actually happened wouldn't perpetuate and support the lie, because there would be nothing to be gained and a great deal to be lost by lying. Even without the news media, you would know and trust people who would know and trust people who would know and tell them that it wasn't true. And not only wouldn't you believe it, in very short order, no one would believe it. Paul tells us in his letters in the New Testament that after the resurrection, Christ appeared to more than 500 citizens of Judea, most of whom, Paul tells us, were still alive at the time Paul was writing and preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. Do you know what that means? It means that if Christ did not rise from the dead, that if what the Apostle Paul was saying and writing about the resurrection of Christ were not true, not a single one of those 500 witnesses would have existed, which means that thousands upon thousands would have called Paul a liar. And not just Paul, but all of the apostles who were fanning out all across the Mediterranean telling the same story. Yet just the opposite happened. The story of Christ's resurrection not only spread like wildfire, it spread like wildfire despite a driving thunderstorm of opposition. So credible was the story of the gospel that thousands of people who lived at the time of Jesus and who had the ability to know, or whose closest friends, family members, co-workers, and neighbors had the ability to know, whether the story of Christ's death and resurrection was true or false, came out in public, asking to be baptized when being a follower of Christ meant torture, persecution, financial ruin, social disgrace, and death. Notwithstanding these enormous obstacles, Christianity, led by a small and unlikely band of uneducated and unremarkable men, swept the world. You know, the most popular, most widely admired, and most deeply mourned political leader of the last 100 years in America would undoubtedly be President John F. Kennedy. In Dallas, where he died, 2 white X's have been painted on the street, where the first and the second bullets hit him as the motorcade passed by the Texas Schoolbook Depository. That's where Lee Harvey Oswald took aim and fired from the 6th-floor window. That building is now a museum where hundreds of thousands of people come every year to learn, to remember, and to relive those awful days when JFK was cut down in the prime of his life. Almost immediately after President Kennedy's death, a movement of people of all ages who shared his vision for America sprang up and became advocates for what his successor, President Lyndon Johnson, would call the Great Society. The ideals that animated John F. Kennedy when he was alive still animate American politics today, and the followers and admirers of JFK have grown by the millions since his death. They hold the reins of power in American government, in academia, and in the media and Hollywood. But as beloved and admired as JFK was then and is now, and as grief-stricken and desperate and afraid as his followers were, if you had sent 12 people out onto the streets of Dallas 3 days after JFK's assassination to say that he had risen from the dead, no one would have believed you. People would not have gathered in public by the thousands to be baptized into the church of JFK. No one would have published papers attesting to his resurrection, and even if someone did, no one would have bothered to read them or copy them over and over again and again, laboriously by hand, to be distributed all around the world and cherished more than life itself. These things would not happen because people would know the story was not true. How would they know? They would know either because they were there or because they had friends and family members or other people they trust who were there and who would tell them that no such thing ever happened. They would know it was a lie because if JFK had walked out of Parkland Hospital alive and unharmed in front of hundreds of people 3 days after the world witnessed his head literally being blown apart, people everywhere would have known this and everyone would have been talking about it, which, of course, is exactly what happened after Christ's death and resurrection. This is why the Bible tells us the men on the road to Emmaus were so incredulous that anyone within miles of Jerusalem could be unaware that Christ had risen from the dead, because the entire region was buzzing with the news. But even if by some miracle you were able to convince thousands of strangers for no apparent reason or advantage to themselves to lie to their families and friends that JFK had risen from the dead, you can bet that when armed guards showed up at their doors, held a gun to their heads, and told them either to recant their story or die, all of them would have recanted. And why wouldn't they? They would know they were lying, and there's no point in lying if there's no advantage in the lie. Why not tell the truth and live? But it was a very different story in first century Palestine, and it was different because the facts were different. Ordinary Christians chose to be burned at the stake or torn apart by wild animals rather than deny the miracle of the resurrection, not as it was told or taught to them from a book, but as they or those they knew and trusted had actually witnessed it. So no, Christ doesn't tell us just not to fear. He doesn't just tell us to have faith that we will live after death. He shows us with his own death and resurrection that it is true. We have faith we can do it because we know that Christ has done it. Christ doesn't stand in the boat and offer to push Peter out of it into the water. Christ is standing on the water when he asks Peter to come to him. Christ has shown Peter that it can be done, and he asks Peter to have faith that he will be lifted up by the same power and in the same way. You may notice that Christ also doesn't explain to Peter why there is a storm at sea to begin with, nor does he calm the storm just for Peter's benefit. Christ doesn't solve this problem for Peter. Instead, he simply tells Peter not to fear the storm and to walk out to meet him anyway. Likewise, Christ doesn't tell us why our wife or husband left us, why our father or son is an alcoholic, or why there are people in the world seemingly bent on hurting us and destroying us. He doesn't explain the storms in our lives. He just reassures us that the storm is not all there is. Peter sinks because he insists on living in the world he can see and interpreting that world through the laws of his earthly knowledge and understanding. Christ is calling him to have faith in a world he cannot see, and one that is governed by laws he cannot understand. No one has all the answers in this world, but I do know this. If we don't let go and take those first seemingly impossible steps, if we don't leap, if we cling to our anger and outrage and our insecurity, if we choose to despair rather than to hope, we won't see God because we'll never reach him. The little baby doesn't know why it's going to be okay if he lets go and walks toward his parents. He just chooses to rely more on his faith in his father and mother than his fear in himself. And he lets himself be drawn by the hope and excitement of discovering something totally new. I am very flattered by and grateful for the people who worry about my safety when I am at sea. You make me know that I matter, that I am loved and wanted. But I am secretly a bit amused by people who hear I'm sailing across an ocean and say, "Aren't you afraid you might die?" I sometimes want to pull those people into a quiet corner and ask them, "Have you got an angle on some kind of deal where, if I don't get on a boat, I won't die?" Most of us live our lives as though death is something that happens to people who don't eat right, get enough exercise, or know how to plan well. But of course, death is coming for us all, and he won't be detained. We can either live huddled in fear and denial and let him corner us and sink our ship in the harbor, or we can sail out to meet him. What exactly then did Christ say about fear? Are we simply to be blissfully confident and walk around the earth like happy idiots, oblivious to every danger? Certainly not. In the 10th chapter of Matthew, we have the story of Jesus sending his disciples out into the world to preach the good news. What does he tell them? He doesn't tell them the world isn't a scary place. On the contrary, he says, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Then he tells them what they need to be truly afraid of, and it's not that they might get beaten up on the side of the road, or that they might lose their job and be unable to pay their mortgage, or that they might get sick and die. Christ tells them that none of those things have the power to harm them. He tells them instead to be afraid of Satan. Quote, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." End quote. Yet, in the face of this fear, he gives them and us someone to trust who is bigger than our fears, and who cares about us and our happiness. And that someone is God. He says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." What Jesus seems to me to be saying is that we are afraid of the wrong things. You and I are both afraid that I might fall off my boat in the middle of the ocean, alone, far from aid, and never see my home and family again. If you are fortunate enough to have a job, you are probably afraid of losing it. We're all afraid of illness and death, or of burglars, or bullies, or pain, or not having enough money for rent or food or clothing. If you want proof that the world is on the wrong track, ask yourself what the world is afraid of, and I think you'll find it to be everything but what is truly scary. Tell any one of your friends that you're afraid of the devil, and they'll smile and chuckle and pat you on the back. Tell them that you're afraid of dying, and they'll respond with the utmost gravity and seriousness. It's not that people who are afraid of dying are cowards, or that we shouldn't comfort the sick. The point is that we're all dying, right now, this very minute. Yet for many of us, the health of our soul, the only part of our being that will endure forever, is the stuff of children's fairy tales, while the health of our bodies, the only thing that is absolutely certain not to endure for any of us, occupies all of our effort and attention. I don't mean to put on a false air of bravado. Fear of physical danger and illness is a natural and unavoidable part of our human condition. The Apostle Peter showed us that when he denied Christ 3 times out of fear for his own physical safety. But as it was in Peter's case, our fear is a direct affront to Christ and our Christian faith, because it is telling Christ that we regard his sacrifice as insufficient to save us, and we regard his promise of a better life to come as illegitimate. So let there be no mistake. The answer to fear is revealed to us in the question Christ asked of his disciples, who were terrified of the storm in the boat. Where is your faith? In other words, the solution to fear is faith. But the fact remains that we are imperfect vessels of that faith. We waver, we wander, we doubt, and we must strive every day to strengthen and aid our faith, to give ourselves every advantage. How do we do that? By coming to St. Luke's. I feel less frightened every time I see each of you on a Sunday morning. And if you come to St. Luke's on a Sunday morning, when it reopens one day, that's what you'll find, a gathering of cowards who know what it is that's truly scary in the world, and who come there literally to encourage each other, to give each other courage. So hopefully I have encouraged all of you to face your fears with greater confidence. Now I'd like to shift my focus to the other subject of tonight's talk, and that is loneliness. But loneliness has a darker side, and that is where we encounter something much more dangerous called despair. 10 hours more or less after I leave London, I will arrive at JFK Airport, met there by no one, greeted by not one familiar face. No one will speak to me except to ask me for my passport or thank me for flying with them, or perhaps as the 800th person at Starbucks that day who will be told to have a good day. But I will welcome even that contact a bit more than usual because I will be lonely, and human contact of any kind to a lonely person is like water to a thirsty man. And I will board the Long Island Railroad to take it out to the end of the line. The people I meet most likely will treat me with that mixture of politeness and indifference that passes for kindness among strangers. I will eventually find my way to my boat. She will be dirty and looking a bit run down and unloved, having spent last summer, fall, and winter propped up on metal jack stands in a gravel parking lot strewn with abandoned paint pots and the assorted detritus of boatyards. When I first see her, the realization of the hard work ahead of me to get her ready for sea will hit me like a cold wave, and I will be lonely, and I will be afraid. What I have been busy planning for the last 6 months will start to seem, in that moment, suspiciously like the most obvious of mistakes and the most ridiculous of delusions. I will begin to doubt myself. Memories of past mistakes I have made will pay a visit and stay for tea to make unwelcome comparisons and draw unhelpful conclusions. But then, after lying a while in the bed I have made for myself, I will grow bored with self-pity, and I will get up and get to work. As I make my way through that work, I will meet passers-by in the shipyard who will ask me what I'm up to. And when I tell them I'm crossing the Atlantic, their first question will be, "By yourself?" And when I say yes, I will see, as I always do, the gleam in their eye that says, "This man might be out of his mind." Then they will look at my boat and say incredulously, "In that thing?" That's when I will know that I'm not speaking to a long-distance sailor, because a long-distance sailor would take one look at Nevermore and see the nautical equivalent of Zola Budd. Small, slender, without a lot of high-tech equipment, but absolutely built to go long distances. But because sailors nowadays don't really sail anymore, and instead mostly motor and drink their way around protected harbors in luxury yachts, where they spend most of their time in port waiting for extra crew and a spare part for their water maker and a new compressor for their refrigerator and a new hot water heater for the shower and the master bath, they will not understand how anyone could cross an ocean in that thing. And when he is over the shock, he will ask me, "Have you done much sailing before?" And just out of boredom, I will say, "No, never, but I took a correspondence course last week and made a score of 71%. And each of the dozen people I will have this exact conversation with over the next 2 weeks will go home to a warm house and a warm, soft bed and a functioning toilet that isn't tilting sideways. And they will think, "What in God's name is he doing? Thank God it's him and not me." And after I have had this same conversation 3 dozen times more, I will start to think, "What in God's name am I doing?" And I will still be lonely and afraid, but in that moment I will face something new. I will face the temptation to despair. I imagine that Christ asked himself that same question, "What in God's name am I doing here?" as he wandered alone for 40 days in the desert. And we of course know that in that moment, Satan was at his elbow, tempting him to despair. "Throw yourself down from this mountaintop," he goaded him. "Give up, give in to despair. You have no hope. You're all alone. No one loves you. You have no father. Everyone thinks you're a fool. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Why can't you be normal like other people? Other people have satisfying and successful lives, earning a good living, well regarded by all, enjoying some richly deserved luxury and status. But look at you. You have no friends. You have no home. You have no job. You have no career. You have no money. You're a fool. You have nothing to live for." When I hear that same voice telling me to despair at my situation, whether I be sick or thirsty or lonely or threatened by a storm or by boredom, my only defense will be to remind myself of what Christ knew when he faced the same questions. What did Christ know? Well, first and foremost, he knew who it was who was speaking to him out there in the desert, tempting him to despair. Satan despises our faith, our hope, our love, and our perseverance in the face of our fear and loneliness. Fear and loneliness are part of the human condition, but despair is a trap of the devil. Despair is fear without faith, and loneliness without hope. Faith and hope come from God. Despair comes from down below. And the most important tool we have in resisting despair in not giving in to that negative voice in our heads is to know who it is who is speaking to us. What exactly is despair? Despair is a disheveled, dodgy-looking man in a dark alley whispering and motioning us to come over and share a drink with him of what he's hiding in a brown paper bag. Most of us in our daily lives wouldn't linger to ponder the wisdom of going over to that man, or tie ourselves up in knots wondering whether we should or shouldn't go over there and have a bit of what he's offering. Most of us would have no problem in walking right past that sort of man without a sidelong glance. We intuitively know that what he's offering is not healthy or good for us. And yet when we are drawn to despair, we allow ourselves to be convinced that that dark alley is the only place left for us to go. But of course the answers to our problems are never there. Looking back on my own life, there isn't one problem I've had, no matter how big or small, that has been made better or easier to bear, much less solved, by despairing over it. Fear and loneliness are facts of our human condition, like hunger and thirst. But despair is a choice. How do you conquer despair? Simple, you do what Christ did. First, you resist, and then you get about your business. You do something else. You avoid it in the same way you avoid that man in the dark alley. You just keep on walking. When Satan brought Christ to the top of the mountain and tempted him to throw himself down, he was tempting him to despair. He was inviting him to embrace hopelessness and nihilism and a sense that nothing, even his own life, mattered. How did Christ resist that temptation? First, by knowing who it was who was speaking to him. I'm amazed by how many Christian scholars and theologians go all giggly and slightly embarrassed when you start talking about the devil. The American comedian Flip Wilson's signature punchline was, "The devil made me do it." He was famous for his comedy sketches where he tried to rationalize all his unsavory behavior by claiming the devil was really to blame. These sketches made Wilson a millionaire because the idea of a spiritual nemesis lurking in the shadows, horns and all, making us do the things we ought not to do seems a bit silly. Blaming the devil for our failures sounds a bit like blaming the family dog for eating our homework, and so it gets a lot of laughs. The loudest laugh, however, no doubt comes from the devil himself, because I'm sure it doesn't matter to him whether you believe in him or not. He just wants you to come join him in that dark alley and share a drink called despair. So to the Christian intellectuals who no longer have use for quaint notions of heaven and hell and angels and demons, I say this: if there is no Satan, if there is no hell, if there is no risk to us of embracing what Satan has to offer, then Christ's life, death, and resurrection were pointless, and so too is your life. Christ knew one thing on that mountaintop. He knew who was calling him to throw away everything of real meaning and value for an empty promise. Our best defense and our only defense, therefore, is to imitate Christ, to resist Satan by resisting and ignoring the despair to which Satan calls us, to just keep moving, to get up, to do something, to go somewhere, to sit down at the piano, to pick up a paintbrush, to pick up a pen and write to a very old friend, to pick up the telephone, to slip into our gardening boots, anything. Do whatever, but whatever you do, don't give in to despair, because despair is a lie. Despair is a drug dealer offering you a pill and saying, you might as well take it, you're never going to find happiness. Despair is a prostitute beckoning you over and saying, you might as well pay me to pretend to love you because you're never going to find true love. Despair is a gambling house beckoning you to give away your hard-earned money and saying, you might as well take a chance because you're never going to succeed on your own. Fear and loneliness aren't the real problem. They remind us that we are human. The real evil, and I use the word evil deliberately, is where we allow fear and loneliness to lead us. The real evil is when we allow our fear and loneliness to sink into despair. When I was 15 years old, my mother sent me to spend 2 summers on the family farm in Tennessee where her father had been raised and where she and her sisters had gone to live for a time during the Great Depression when their own parents could no longer afford to keep them. In this farmhouse, where my great-aunt and uncle still lived when I came there in the early 70s, there was no indoor plumbing and no heat but a wood stove. no running water, no indoor bathroom, just an outhouse. But there were fields and woods full of wild game and creeks full of fish, and to a teenage boy who loved the outdoors as much as I did, it was heaven. Then one day, into this heaven came walking a beautiful girl my age with long blonde hair. She was a farmer's daughter from the next farm over. She had heard about the boy from the big city who had moved into the neighbor's place down the road, and she had come by to have a look for herself. She invited me to accompany her family the following Sunday to church. Being an Episcopalian, I naturally asked her, "What church do you go to?" Because where I came from, whether you were a Baptist or a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Catholic, said a lot about who you were. She answered that she and her family attended the Church of Christ. And I said, "Well, I know you attend the Church of Christ, but what church do you go to?" And she told me again, "We go to the Church of Christ." And that was the beginning of my encounter with a little Bible church in Greenwood, Tennessee, that changed my life. I became a regular churchgoer that summer, even if, I must confess, my interest in the beautiful farmer's daughter was at first far greater than my curiosity about the gospel. But then the members of this church did a remarkable thing. As a sign of their affection, they presented me with a leather-bound Bible, Revised Standard Version, engraved on the front in gold leaf with my name. The year was 1973. I remember taking that Bible home to the farmhouse where I lived and staying up all night reading page after page of the New Testament. I was mesmerized by it. I had never read anything so completely compelling before. I began to realize I had found the answer to many of the questions in my life. How should I conduct myself? What should I do for others? What kind of man should I aspire to be? Why am I here? What is truth? I had finally found a father who I knew loved me and whom I could trust. I had finally found my heading. I had found true north. I experienced an enormous comfort knowing from that moment onward that no matter where I went in life, no matter how lost I became, no matter how thick the fog, no matter how great the storm, I could always return to this book and find true north again. I had found my faith, which is not to say that I had found all the answers. As Pope Francis very wisely said, "Faith is not a light which scatters all our darkness, but a light which guides our steps in the night and suffices for the journey." The truth is, there is a lot I don't know and don't understand about my faith. I don't know why the Old Testament tells us of a God who slaughters innocent children on Passover and commands the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child in the land of Canaan. I don't know why the Apostle Paul is so hard on homosexuals and women, or why Jesus, who is full of compassion and mercy, appears to be so rigid and unforgiving toward those who seek to find love again after divorce. Honestly, these things make no sense to me, just as, I suppose, it made no sense to Eve that she shouldn't eat the fruit of a particular tree in the garden. We are not told that God gave Adam and Eve a detailed explanation of the reasons why the fruit of this particular tree, which appeared to be perfectly delicious, was so harmful, or why, for that matter, a poisonous tree was placed in the center of a garden to begin with. How many times did our parents tell us not to do something for reasons that we didn't understand and would later realize we were incapable of understanding at the time? Eve's fatal mistake was not that she bit into an apple, but that she bought into the lie that she could become her own true north. Do you remember the serpent's lie to Eve? That if she ate of the forbidden fruit, she would become like God. Our fatal mistake is the same. To imagine, as Eve did, that when we wake up in the morning each day, we will meet God in the mirror, and that we can rely on the God in the mirror to tell us all of the things that a just God should and should not require of us. Instead of seeing ourselves as made in the image of God, we remake God in our own image. We imagine that we can be our own true north, and so not surprisingly, we wind up sailing in circles. But instinctively, something tells us that's a lie. As frustrating and at times infuriating as our parents are, we know we need them. and that without them we would not exist, and that they deserve our loyalty and honor and obedience. As frustrating and at times infuriating as God can be, I know that I need him, that without him I would not exist, and that he deserves my loyalty and honor and obedience. Unlike the atheist, I don't regard my discomfort with some of God's commandments, or my inability to answer all of the difficult questions about Christianity, or to solve the mystery of how God created the world, as grounds to reject faith. If I were to give you a picture of the face of your mother or father in the form of a puzzle scattered into 10,000 pieces, and you began to put the puzzle together, long before you had found the last piece, in fact I wager that long before you had found the last 200 pieces, you would begin to see the face that was emerging. And while it would be true at that moment that you hadn't yet found all the pieces of the puzzle, you would never say, well, this is a picture of a cow, or this is a picture of nothing, or there is no picture to be seen here. It is the same with faith in God. I know two things for absolute certain. I have firmly fitted two pieces of the puzzle. One is that the universe did not will itself into existence, and the other is that I am not God. As to the first point, because there is no natural phenomenon by which we can even conceive of non-existence, much less any logic by which non-existence can contain the tools required to produce existence, we know intuitively that some intelligent power beyond our comprehension lies behind and beneath and beyond the world we see. As to the second point, I know for certain that the man I meet in the mirror every morning is not God. He is a frail, fearful, and unreliable fellow who cannot be trusted very far or long to follow a single word of his own advice. Those two certainties are the latitude and the longitude of my faith, but they are given meaning and direction by the true north of the gospel. There is another equally important truth that has been revealed to me much more gradually as I have gotten older. As a younger man, I used to believe that if I just prayed hard enough and disciplined myself strictly enough, I could achieve or very nearly achieve that state of perfection to which we were all called as infants in our baptismal gowns when the priest exhorted us to, quote, bring this garment unstained into the light of God's kingdom, end quote. The truth is, the older I get, the less impressed with myself I become. In fact, I'm like the Chicago Cubs playing the New York Yankees. It's the bottom of the ninth inning, and people are already leaving the stands because there's no use pretending any longer that I can tie the score, much less win the game. Sure, I know where true north is, and I can stand here and point you straight toward it, but the older I get, and the longer I've been on this voyage, the more I'm realizing that I'm never going to get there on my own. And guess what? Neither are you. Neither is any of us. All of us are going to sail wide of the mark, veer off course, and run up on the rocks. Let's face it, we're all lousy at this sailing business. But Christ has given us a set of course corrections in the form of two simple instructions that are almost impossible to misunderstand. One is to love God with all our heart, and the other is to love our neighbor as ourselves. On this, he tells us, hang all of the law and the prophets. The golden rule is the rule to which all other rules are subject. And so when Christ elsewhere tells us to stop judging one another lest we be judged, we recognize that rule as a subcategory of the love your neighbor rule. Because I love my neighbor, and because I know how far off course from true north I have veered, it's not my job to judge you or anyone else about how well you're sailing. That is between you and God. I'm not a member of the management in this organization. I have two very simple menial jobs on this earth. One is to love God, and the other is to love you. Judging you is not in my job description. None of us hits the mark. None of us can steer a straight course for true north. We all, at times, despite our best efforts, succumb to fear, loneliness, and despair. We all sink beneath the waves, just as Peter did. If I am wise and awake, and I don't give in to fear and despair, when I find myself sinking, I will not dwell on my failure and berate myself for my cowardice and weakness. Instead, I will reach out and take Christ's hand, just as Peter did. It's important also to remember that Christ hasn't left us alone on the ocean in the darkness without means of calling for help. He has given us a radio. It's called prayer, and as with the life raft, we should be using that radio every day, not just for emergency calls. When it comes to prayer, there is a great lesson waiting for us in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was there that Christ, who of all people knew that his suffering and death was necessary, prayed on the eve of his crucifixion that the cup of his suffering might pass from him. Why did he pray for this? Because Christ also knew that all things are possible for God. And have you ever noticed what's missing from the story of Christ's prayer in the garden? What is missing is any perceptible answer from God. We are not told that a voice spoke from the clouds to give Christ some reassurance that his prayer had been heard and was at least being taken under advisement. What follows Christ's prayer in the garden is what seemingly so often follows our prayers, and that is silence. Silence, but not indifference. Because God knew, and so also did Christ know, and so too can we know, that whatever our lot, it is well with our soul. I told you at the outset of this talk that I would answer the question, why do I sail across oceans when I am often afraid and lonely? The way I see it, God has given us the gift of life and this incredible world in which to spend our lives. It's no secret to any of us that our time on this beautiful planet is limited, and every man, while he still draws breath, has the right to explore the world that has been given to him. The great age of exploration begins anew with the birth of each human being. So, knowing this, the question for me has always been not why someone would want to cross an ocean, but why wouldn't anyone want to cross an ocean if he could? Why wouldn't you want to fly on the wind across a magical sea and sail in the wake of Columbus, Magellan, Drake, and Captain Cook? If the answer is, well, I really wouldn't want to do that because I wouldn't find exploring the world by sea terribly interesting, then fine. But too often what keeps us from pursuing our dreams, whether they be crossing oceans or anything else, is not that we don't want to do such things, but that we're afraid. We are not willing to take the risk, we tell ourselves. We are not willing to trust the advice of the American philosopher John Burroughs, who said, "Leap, and the net will appear." Like Peter, we don't believe the net will appear, and we tell ourselves we can't afford the risk of what might happen when it doesn't. But the truth is that one day, no matter how cautious we are, no matter how many Brussels sprouts we do eat, and no matter how many steak and kidney pies we don't eat, no matter how many yoga and Pilates classes we take, no matter how many kale smoothies we drink, no matter how many hours we spend at the gym, no matter how many miles we run, no matter how often we wash our hands or how far we stay away from crowds, whether we sail across all the oceans of the world or never wander farther than Charlton Park, the risk of death that is a part of every life will catch up with us. I am told that a century ago every English schoolboy was required to learn these lines by heart from a poem by Lord Macaulay. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, "To every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" And when we stand before God in that moment, and he says to us, "I made oceans and mountains and wonders for you to see and experience," what did you think of them? What shall we, who chose to run from life's fearful odds rather than embrace and relish them, say in reply? That we would have loved to have seen and done all of these things, but we couldn't afford the risk. And then won't God surely laugh as he spreads out the glory of heaven and all eternity before us and says, "What risk?" Thank you all very much for listening. May God bless us all.